One of our founding fathers, John Quincy Adams, once wrote, "If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader." If you look at the life of Major General Perry M. Smith, you'll see he's followed this path in his ethics, service to our country, role model to others, and contributions to his home, Augusta, Georgia. As the son of an Army officer, he lived in many places throughout his youth, one of which was Pearl Harbor in the early 1940s.
When I was a little boy, I was 5 years old. In the summer of 1940, my dad got an assignment to Hawaii. Now that was very exciting for the family to go to Hawaii. It's a very special place. And of course, there was a lot of military there. The Navy fleet was there. There were a lot of Army Air Corps people there and a lot of Army people. There was a kind of forward place for the United States military. So we stayed there, and my dad was over there on a 3-year tour, and everything was fine. And we would go to Sunday school every Sunday, and I would go to school. I went to kindergarten, and I went to the first grade and the second grade. And then on the 7th of December, 1941, we got up as always, and we got on the truck that picked us up in Honolulu. We were living in Honolulu, and they were taking us to an Army post called Fort DeRussy, which is right by Waikiki Beach and very close to Pearl Harbor and Hickam Air Force Base, or in those days, Hickam Field. And as we drove closer and closer to the post, everything seemed fine. But then all of a sudden, the truck stopped at the main gate. And it never stopped at the main gate, so I was curious, so I kind of looked around the side of the truck. I was sitting in the kind of the back seat, the back place, and I noticed an Army captain was there in a World War I helmet and had a sidearm on, and he was talking very excitedly to the truck driver who was driving us. And he had a uniform on, the captain did, and that was strange because we never stopped the main gate. You almost never saw anybody in uniform on a Sunday, and he was armed, and that was very strange. So I was curious about that, I remember that. And then all of a sudden, the truck driver turned around, squealed around, and started driving back and dropping us off, but didn't explain to us what was going on. And then there was, the older kids seemed to be figuring it out. They were looking out the back, and you could see smoke, and you can see a lot of airplanes flying around, and you could hear some noise, kind of strange rumbling kind of noise is my recollection of that. And so I got kind of scared and I started crying, and my sister was trying to make me feel calm, and they were talking about we're at war, there's an attack, the Japanese. So somehow or other the word got back into the back of the truck. Maybe the driver shouted something. But anyhow, he went back, and we were some of the last kids to be left off, so we were finally back. And we got out of the truck, you know, and I was kind of dazed, didn't know what was going on, really didn't know what a war was. I mean, I was only 6. And my mother and my grandmother by this time were frantic because they'd sent their kids off, and they sent them off to war. And so they were so happy to see the truck come up, and they grabbed both of us and gave us a huge hug. Both of them gave us a hug, and I thought, that's funny, because we weren't a hugging family. I mean, very seldom anybody hug. You know, we would shake hands and say thank you or whatever. And I was really surprised because we hadn't done very well that day. We hadn't even gotten to Sunday school. I mean, I couldn't tell her about what I learned in Sunday school because we never made it. We ended up then going to St. Cloud, Minnesota. Later that spring, maybe in April, we went to St. Cloud where my uncle lived. We had no home. My dad was still in Hawaii. We had no family home because we were military people, so we went to my uncle's home. He had a pretty good big house in St. Cloud. And it was very cold. I remember the transition from Hawaii to St. Cloud was quite interesting, lots of snow. And then they found out that I had been in Pearl Harbor, and they asked me in the 2nd grade to get up and tell my story. And I did. I didn't like it because I was a very shy little boy, but I got up and told the story. And then they would ask me questions, you know, Why weren't we ready? Was it Roosevelt's fault? These were usually the teacher that would ask that question, something like that. And of course, I didn't know the answers. But then I'd ask my mom, and then later my dad came back. And as we moved around from St. Cloud to Zanesville, Ohio, to Wilmington, North Carolina, to Richmond, Virginia during the war, from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, I kept giving this talk to the Cub Scouts and to Sunday school class and to my 3rd grade, 4th. I was beginning to answer questions on things like that.
Then, in 1946, Perry's father became the operations officer for Italy, and the family moved overseas. This was an important job and part of an effort to get Italy back on its feet and keep communism from taking over.
And then in May of 1947, May Day, which is a very big day in socialist countries and a very big day in communist countries, we were in Milan, Italy. Milan was really big with the communists. The mayor was a communist and all that. And they had this huge demonstration to support communism and socialism and all that business. And these big red flags, they were waving these big red flags and people were cheering and all that. And we were barricaded in an American requisitioned hotel looking over this for the whole day with lots of soldiers in battle garb because the fear was they might storm the hotel to come after the Americans because there were a lot of communists that didn't like the Americans and all that. So that was another experience I had. By this time I'm about 12 years old. So with the Pearl Harbor experience and then my Italian experiences, I really kind of had a jump start into international affairs, which carried me on for many years into the future. I was born at West Point in 1934. Came back after the war. My dad was stationed in the Pentagon. And then we ended up back at West Point, where I had been born. My dad got a job back up there. So I did my high school years at West Point, and immediately from then, 6 days after graduating from high school, I went immediately into the military academy. Then the military academy for 4 years. I played lacrosse, I played ice hockey. I was a roommate with an All-American football player who was his picture was on the cover of Sports Illustrated, one of the first issues of Sports Illustrated. So we were a group of people who had leadership positions and we were kind of like athletes. We were athletes. He was particularly a good athlete. And so it was a tough 4 years, but we learned a lot, got to learn a lot about honor. We learned a lot about leadership and all that. I went at West Point in 1952. I was a very skinny, barely able to get in. I was 6 feet 3.5, weighed 150 pounds, barely got in. Wasn't a particularly good athlete, did pretty well academically. And after the first year, we had a chance to pick our roommates for the rest of the time we were there. And 2 guys came up to me at the summertime between our freshman year and our sophomore year. And they came up to me and said, "Perry, we want you to be our roommate." And they were both really outstanding guys. And I couldn't understand why they wanted a little nothing me, skinny nothing me, to be their roommate. And so I asked them, I said, "Well, why would you want me?" And they said, "That's simple, Perry. We are dumb and you are smart. And you're going to get us through this place." We all took the same courses, except for languages, foreign language. We all took the same courses, and so therefore you were able to help the roommates. Well, I did help them, and when they got ready for class, I'd sit down and I'd look at the class, and I would decide these are important points, not on all subjects, but on particularly hard subjects like fluid dynamics and solid dynamics. So I actually did help them through, but by doing so, I then did much better than I would have because I had to prepare them for the class, and by doing that, I was prepared myself. And so I learned that by helping other people, you help yourself. And that was a really, really powerful lesson. I've seen that so many times in life. You help people, and next thing you know, they help you, and it works out. So the helping syndrome is really, really important in life. And I learned it very early. I was only like 18 years old when those roommates picked me. Then we stayed together for 3 years. My number one roommate was a first-team All-American football player on the cover of Sports Illustrated when Sports Illustrated was brand new. And he was well known all over the country as a first-team All-American football player. He later earned sportsmanship awards, but he's killed in combat. He's the one at whose wedding I met. He was killed. One of the saddest moments in my life was October '67 when he was killed in combat. And they've named the great athletic center for him at West Point, the indoor athletic center. My other roommate and I were great friends. We played lacrosse together. We played the same position together. We were actually competing for the same position. But we are dear friends even to this day. When I was a cadet at West Point, the Air Force Academy had not been constructed yet, hadn't started yet, and so therefore at the graduation point in my class in 1956, 25% of us had a chance to go in the Air Force. I thought that was really kind of a neat idea because I had watched the Thunderbirds, their acrobatic team, put on a show when I was between my sophomore and junior years. And I was so impressed by the precision of that flying and the firepower demonstration they showed at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. And there was also so much kind of newness and maybe a bit of glamour in this new United States Air Force, which had so much budget and so many new airplanes and so much emphasis in the budget, that I said I wanted to do that. One of the most marvelous things in my life is when I met Connor, my wife. And I met her at a wedding in Alexandria, Virginia. I was flying airplanes out in the West, and I got a chance to be the best man in a wedding. And it turned out that she was going to be the maid of honor. So I flew back from Arizona to Virginia. I walked into the place we were going to be staying, and my roommate from West Point, my great roommate from West Point, the All-American football player, Don Hollader, grabbed me as I walked in the front door, and he says, "You're about ready to meet the maid of honor. And Perry, you've got to marry this girl." And I looked at him kind of funny, and I said, "Wait a minute, Don, I haven't even met this girl." He says, "No, you've got to marry her." And I said, "Why?" He says, "Well, let me tell you. She's gorgeous, she's a Southern belle, she's a redhead, and she's an Episcopalian. You've got to marry this girl." Well, I wasn't so sure about that, but sure enough, he was right. And then we got married at St. Paul's on the 9th of May, 1959. We've been married for well over 50 years, and it was really the right thing to do. He gave me very good advice. If it hadn't been for that wedding, we never would have met, because I'm an Air Force guy, and this is an Army town. I never would have been stationed at Fort Gordon. I never would have come to Augusta. So just because of the great good fortune of being in a wedding at that moment in time led to such a wonderful life. So I volunteered to go in the Air Force, was selected to go in the Air Force, and so went into the Air Force. And then I stayed in the fighter business pretty much right on through and flew lots of different fighters during my career. First fighter I flew was a F-84F, and then the F-100, the F-4, and the F-15. That was over a period of more than 20 years, and so each fighter was a considerably better fighter than the last one. We had lots of trouble with the F-100, which I flew for many years. I flew the F-100 from 1958 until 1964, straight on through as an operational pilot, and we had all kinds of problems with those airplanes. In fact, we would lose an airplane crashed every month right on through. Out of a total of 80 airplanes, we'd lose one per month. It was a very high accident rate. A lot of people got killed flying this airplane because it would quit and it would spin out. It was not well designed. This is about 1960, flying in Europe. It's flying at night. I had a wingman. The weather was bad, although we were above the bad weather, so it was clear. And we were coming back from a mission, and all of a sudden I noticed the cockpit unlight light came on, which is not good news. And I noticed that the canopy was beginning to come back. And I thought I was going to lose the canopy, because what the canopy does is it comes back and then it starts opening. And I knew that as soon as it went up into the airstream would yank it off. And so I called my wingman. I said, "I got a problem, I may lose my canopy." And I said, "Stay clear." And he was clear enough, so it was out of the way. Well, it didn't open, it stopped, and there was a gap here, and I lost all pressurization because all the compressed air went out of the cockpit. So it was like getting hit in the chest and throwing out all the air. So all of a sudden I had all the air thrown out of my lungs because I had decompression. And a couple of seconds later then it started to cycle back and it repressurized and the light went out. And so then I got all this pressurization back in, and that would go on for about 3 or 4 seconds, and then it would cycle again. So I was trying to talk, and I was trying to wonder what to do, and I was trying to tell the control agency what was going on, and I was trying to let my wingman know what was going on. But that continued to cycle then until I got on the ground. And I remember very well writing it up. It took me an hour or so to write it up, to explain exactly what happened. It was page after page after page, how long it lasted and what I did and at what altitudes it was worse and all that, because I wanted them to fix it. We didn't want to have that happen again. And about 6 months later, that same airplane was taking off, and just as it broke ground, the canopy came off. It backed off and came off, and the pilot lost control, and he went right straight through the runway barriers and right straight through all the runway lights, poles, and everything. He hurt himself, destroyed the airplane. He survived. And I remember sitting before the accident board, because here was this long write-up that I had given them, and they were asking me about it. And they said, you know, you made a really long, a very detailed write-up 6 months ago. And I said, yeah, because I remember that really well, and I thought we wanted to get it fixed. Well, clearly they hadn't fixed it. They thought they hadn't fixed it. I guess another mission that was pretty exciting. Remember now, I had 180 missions. Some of them were pretty routine. Some of them were a little bit exciting, and a few of them were very exciting. And the ones that were very exciting, the ones you of course remember. But we had a job when I was over there toward the end of my tour of escorting the gunships. These were C-130 big airplanes that had guns that would shoot out the side. And what they would do is they had very good sensors, and they would identify these truck convoys going through, and they would knock out the first truck and the last truck. And then they would try to knock out the other trucks, but then they would go away, and then we would roll in on the convoy to try to knock it out. The truck drivers, of course, as soon as they got felt the pressure, they would all bail out of their trucks and go jump in the ditches. But we wanted to destroy the gear, and once you hit a truck, oftentimes it would explode because it was full of munitions, and so that was our job. The trouble was that the guns, all the anti-aircraft guns, would then start shooting at the gunship. And our job then was to roll in on the guns and drop munitions to keep their heads down and make sure they didn't shoot very accurately at the gunship. Our job was to protect the gunship. And I remember rolling in one time, and there were 6 gun positions, and they were all firing. They seemed to be all firing at me, and they were coming over this way and that way and that way. And I said, there's no way I'm not going to get hit. I was sure I was going to get hit, but I never got hit. There was another time when they were getting so close to hitting the gunship, there were you could see the tracers coming right up to the gunship, and I told the gunship, I said, you got to go home. You're going to get shot down. You got to go home. I said, we'll take care of the targets, because they already had identified the targets for us, and they had enough fires going, so we knew the convoy. We go home. I had to order him to go home because the situation was so difficult. And they did lose a number of those gunships over there. Even though they were flying at 10,000 feet, they were getting shot down because there was so much gunfire that we had to deal with. So that was another mission that was pretty tough. Now, the most interesting experience I had in combat, and I was in combat in F-4 airplanes in 1968 and 1969. I flew 180 missions, 50 over North Vietnam, and then 130 over the Laos area where the Ho Chi Minh Trail was, where they would bring the supplies down into South Vietnam through what was supposed to be a neutral area of Laos, but the North Vietnamese were using it as a major supply corridor, and we were trying to stop the flow. My leader got shot down. And the first thing I noticed was he had rolled in on his target, and as soon as he rolled in on his target, the airplane turned into a huge ball of fire, and the only thing you could see was the nose sticking out. The rest of the airplane was a ball of fire with a lot of smoke behind, so you couldn't see the tail, you couldn't see the wings, you couldn't see the fuselage, all you could see was the nose. And he was going down, and so I shouted to him, you're on fire, bail out, eject, eject, eject. And he kept going down, kept going down, kept going down, and just before he hit, we saw one chute come out. One parachute showed very briefly, and then we didn't see it anymore, and no other second chute came out. Well, it turned out the leader could not get out of his airplane, so he was killed, and the man in the back seat was able to get out at the last minute. And so he radios to us on his little survival radio. After a few minutes, we keep calling him, and he finally comes up on his radio, and he identifies himself. We had a code, so we knew who he was. And he says, I got a real problem. And I said, well, what's the problem? He says, I'm bleeding. No, he says, I'm afraid of the lions. I'm afraid of the lions. I'm sorry. He said, I'm afraid of the tigers. I'm afraid of the tigers. And I asked my backseater, I said, what is he talking about? My backseater was behind me and was a good friend of his. They were both lieutenants, and I was a major, so I didn't know him that well. He says, oh, he's been reading books about Laos, and there's a Laotian tiger that exists in northern Laos. Well, we were operating in an open area in southern Laos where there were no tigers. So I said, forget about the tigers, you go hide quickly, and we'll get somebody in to get you out. And he says, I'm bleeding really bad, really bleeding bad. And he sounded like he was really frightened. And I said, okay, I want you to rip off your t-shirt and I want you to tourniquet so you can stop the bleeding. He says, I can't do that. I said, why not? He's talking on the radio, and I said, why not? He says, because it's my head that's bleeding. And what had happened was the chute had only partially opened because he was so close to the ground when he got out that he'd run into a tree, and his head is split wide open from here right on down. It took 33 stitches to sew him back up. So now his scalp is wide open and he's just bleeding like crazy all over himself. And I said, okay, take that t-shirt and just compress it up against the wound as hard as you can and hold it as tight as you can to try to stop the bleeding. And we'll get somebody in as soon as possible. He said, okay. So we got the whole rescue operation going, and that's very complicated because you need to talk to the control agency, you need to get the Jolly Green Giant helicopters in there, you need to get the supporting gunships in there, the slow airplanes to shoot up the enemy around the area, to throw smoke down, to confuse the enemy, so the helicopters can come in, get him out without the helicopters getting shot down. And they always have two helicopters, a high one and a low one. Well, it took a long time, maybe a couple hours to get them in there. But they got in there, they let the parachute jumper go down on the cable to pick him up because he was in bad shape by this time. He picked him up, got him back in the helicopter, and I remember the pilot says, he's aboard! And you know, by this time there were dozens of airplanes all flying around trying to give him support, and of course we were really happy about that. And we went back and landed, and I beat him back because I had a faster airplane. But he landed in his helicopter at the same base I landed at. So I jumped and ran down there to greet him. He was all bandaged